start and then we can.
And I think we're both kind of asking similar questions.
How is it? Okay, Lexi?
Looks good.
Looks good?
And also, Billy, tell us the one thing I never know also, like when Henning and so tell me when
We're on.
Hi! So here we are.
Hello.
With Bertha Schwarz.
Yeah.
And with Abby, and I'll let you say your last name because I'm blanking out.
Bergson, Abigail Bergson.
Here we are with Abby Bergson, or Abigail Bergson, and Bertha Schwarz. And I'm Jennifer Zunikoff. And today we're doing kind of a follow-up interview.
All right.
And we're going to also interview you about our oral history of the Holocaust class project.
Uh-huh.
So what Abby and I were talking about before is that maybe for the first, let's say, half an hour,
Yes.
we would interview you about your thoughts about the class and even do a little bit of interviewing of Abby, not as much as of you,
Okay.
but to ask her about it and get a little bit of your feelings.
Yeah.
Then, once we got done that, we would really turn things over to you to tell us about everything since the
then.
class.
Okay.
Because Bertha has all kinds of additions to her story that some of the other survivors don't have since the class.
Interview.
Right. So I thought maybe it would make sense for us to kind of go back and talk about that class and then move forward. Is that okay?
Yes. The thing, I think the first thing we have to remember the date when we were, I remember it was Rosh Hashanah. But what year? Do you know?
It was 2006.
Right.
It was the
2006,
fall.
right?
So that's been
3 years now.
almost 3 years.
Almost
Right.
3 years. Okay, this is important to know so that we can follow up what happened since then.
Right. Great.
All right?
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay.
So, all right. So we should begin. Do you want me to start? You want to start?
It doesn't really, I think.
Well, I'll give a little bit, maybe a background about you
Okay.
two,
Yeah.
coming from the
Okay.
teacher's perspective.
All right.
So, at the point that Bertha
Yeah.
and Abby, is it okay if I call you Abby here?
Please do, yeah.
If Bertha and Abby entered the scene, this was the 3rd year of this class, which now has had 5 years. We're entering our 6th.
Uh-huh.
It was, however, only the 2nd year it had been a full class for 3 credits.
I see.
So it's still in the stage of growing and the 3 of us as teachers
Right.
figuring out what's going to happen,
And how to
etc.
do it.
Exactly. We're still figuring it out, but
Okay.
then even more so.
Yeah.
So Abby signed up for the class as a sophomore, and Abby and Laura Mabry and Sarah Mills
Right.
were assigned
Right.
to Bertha.
What happened to the other 2 girls?
Laura transferred after her freshman year. She was a freshman when she interviewed you.
Yes.
To back closer to home, and she's in art school now.
Uh-huh.
I
Okay.
have not talked to her as much since then, though. Sarah
Yeah.
graduated this year as well. She was a history major and is from Baltimore and still living here as well. I don't know much more than that.
You're not in touch with them? With both the girls?
Just a little,
Yeah.
not very much. I didn't know them before the class.
Yeah, I noticed that. I know that you were all getting to know
Right,
each other.
right.
Yeah, so it was a nice experience.
Yeah. Laura and I became close during class. She just transferred.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, boy, her piece was unbelievable.
Mhm.
The way she acted it out. That was very, very unusual. Very emotional. It was very, very strong.
For her too, I know it was very important for her. I remember went home for a while, and it was
Yes.
very important for her to be able to come back to be able
Yeah.
to share that story.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
But she didn't come back.
Well, she did. She went home for a while because I'm not sure if she just was a little
She was
sick
having a hard time.
and having a hard time.
Yeah, she has a hard time.
So she went home, but she made it back for the performance that you saw.
Yes. Oh, really? But
And if it's important, I can get her email address too.
You
I haven't been as in touch regularly.
Yeah.
Steve, who is one of the co-teachers,
Yeah.
has been, and Tova,
Yeah.
who was a student in Billy's class. I found out at the end of the class that the 2 of them have been friends
Oh, really?
when Laura was there. So Tova I am in touch with.
Oh, good.
So I think that
Yeah.
we'll be able to get in touch with Laura.
Okay, good.
So why don't we, do you want to talk a little bit about her, since we're talking about her, any of your thoughts about her presentation, and then we'll move on to anything else?
You mean as far as Laura's presentation?
Yeah, since we're talking about her. Anyway.
Yeah, I think Laura's presentation was it was very interesting for me to see what was out of my story, what the thing that was the most important to her. Her acting out of it, acting it out was very, very unusual. I've never seen. She really was not focusing only on one particular thing, but she was focusing on different stages. She was kind of skipping. But you could still follow, because what she did out of every segment that she portrayed, there was something very painful, very important and painful for her to hear, and therefore she acted it out like that. That's the way I understood it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that part of it was so emotional. And she conveyed it like that, like it's almost like it happened to her.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I felt.
So that's actually one of the questions. So for class, we were actually asked to pick something out from your story that
Yes.
really, made sense to us, and
Yes, like
went back to like what we wanted to tell.
Yes.
And for me, that became like your love of family and Israel,
Right.
and that became the focus of my story. Was it surprising to you, like what became the focuses of our story?
I tell you, I think that with Laura,
Mhm.
I think she never heard anything about. She never met any Jewish person.
Mhm.
I remember, asking her, and she actually said that's the first time that I met a Jewish person. And coming from where she came, she never met any Jewish person. And so, for me, it was very interesting to see how she interpreted what was the focus. As far as with your interpretation, it was much more about family and loss of family, and then going to Israel and kind of, it was kind of, that was the right place to be after the Holocaust. That was a kind of a revival of healing, and and this is what you really wanted to say. It was like hopeful, the terrible things and then the hopeful thing. Is this what you really wanted to do?
Yeah, for me that was what.
Yeah. And of course, being Jewish and
Mhm.
knowing the background, so I think you really emphasize the mere fact that there was a state of Israel after the Holocaust and how important it was.
Do you think then our interpretations of, since both of ours were so different,
Yes.
and it was based on what became most meaningful to us,
Right.
do you think both stories still spoke true to your original story?
Yeah, in a very different way, definitely. I remember you acting out that part, and that was so cute with the dress, the fancy dress, and really. And then, that was really wonderful. That was very touching.
Since I know for both Laura and I, it was very important that even though we interpreted your story,
Yes.
it still
Yeah,
was.
we really never had the chance. See,
Right.
this is why I wanted to meet with you afterwards, but we never had a
Right.
chance to meet again. So we never really reviewed or talked about it,
Well, here we are.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, it was wonderful to hear though that since you were able to view the DVD before you went back to Israel that time,
Yes.
and before we gave our final presentation, so I know for both Laura and I, it was a great relief to hear that you had heard it and that you were
Yes,
comfortable.
yes, and I asked to make copies, and my sisters have a copy of it too in Israel, I made copies for both of them. So that, and I sat with them and watched it together. It was really very touching for us to see all of it. It was like looking back,
And I remember one of the things that most touched me about Laura and Abby's interpretation
Yeah,
was this relationship between you and your sister.
that's right.
And they both picked up on that, and they explored it differently.
Yeah,
But that, when I think of you,
yeah.
I cannot think of you in your story without thinking about
Of my sister.
your sister.
Well, this is until today, It's a responsibility, I think. So, yeah, it's very early on, a very big responsibility, and it's that kind of keeps on going. You kind of, it's difficult to separate. although we try, you know, we have our own life, but definitely we have children and grandchildren. But there is something about us that, you know, there is it's a bond, maybe because of necessity. And I think I never had the chance to show you our trip back to, in the album. I remember I mentioned to you that about 5 years ago, we went back to all the places where we lived and where we, through the war. And I have an album like that, which is unbelievable.
I think on the last day you were able to show us some pictures from it, but not
the whole thing.
not the whole thing.
Right, yeah. Really, I don't remember that.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's a wonderful story by itself.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. We had to reminisce and we talked out things that we never spoke about. And that happened all on the trains, going from one place to another for 17 days, you know. So things that we didn't want to talk about, were afraid to mention, or didn't feel comfortable. And so, you know, and so there were a lot of issues that we had to deal with. For instance, our relationship with our mother, and how she came out of that whole tragedy, and even during the war, you know, what was her responsibility, making sure that we should survive, you know, and what it did on her. And I think that we had, and each of us looked at it different, very, very differently. You know?
You were the oldest?
Yeah, I was the oldest.
And the sister that you were telling her she has to say that she is, what was it, that she is 7, not 6?
Yeah, that's the youngest one.
And what was her name?
Bella.
Bella.
Yeah, and you know, Malka, she's coming again for the Dina's bat mitzvah. She'll be here with her husband. Yeah.
Dina is Bertha's granddaughter.
Yeah, right.
Lovely young
Yeah,
lady.
right. She's unbelievable. She's 13 already. Goes so fast.
And Sam just had his bar mitzvah now.
Yeah,
He's
2 years ago. He's already 15.
and he's also a very, very mature young man. I
Yeah,
think.
he really is. It's very nice to see all my grandchildren, how they develop, and now it's already the next stage, and it's very, very nice. I really enjoy seeing them all, how they interrelate, and it's very interesting that what our relationship affects the relationship of our children with each other. And that's something which I think is very strong. And so that each family, I mean, our children know each other very well. That means they relate very well in here, because we don't have family, so they are very close to each other. But they always were. The thing is that they're also very close to the family in Israel. And my sister's children, Malcolm, my middle sister, she has 9 grandchildren, and her parents, and they are very close, and they take my children in, and so is my younger sister with her children. So they really, it's very interesting how they all are close to each other, but also to their cousins. So, and I think it all that has to do with the influence that they saw our relationship, you know. So.
Well, thinking of your grandchildren, at least your daughter Mira's children, who I know from Chevret Tzedakah Synagogue, I was thinking, Abby and I were talking about on our way here how Abby and Laura had performed the following semester after they interviewed you. So in the, I suppose, April or May of 2007, they came to Chevret Tzedakah, and you spoke as well.
Yeah, right.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. What was that like, having them at your home place, your synagogue, your daughter's synagogue, your grandchildren's synagogue, performing again there?
That was, I think it was done well. I think it was a little too short, and there were not enough people there, unfortunately, but In the meantime, the interest grew because I came only a couple of months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And did you see how many people were there? Compared to, I think when you came, there were maybe 15, 20 people. I think there must have been 50, even more. Nobody left after the service, and they stayed to see the performance. So I think that the whole issue of the Holocaust has changed a lot, the attitude of people wanting to know about the Holocaust. I noticed that very much. You know, there are many more books, there is a lot, you know, the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community has had a much greater interest about the Holocaust. Well, I think that I was glad that I could add to it, and I think that was an important part that I could say, add to the story because it was so short. You know, and so that part of it, I would say it would be a good idea to have it a little longer, not so short, and maybe I don't know. Yes, I think it's important that the person of who you talk to should be able to participate.
Definitely.
You know, I think that part of it, because then he gives his own whatever he feels is missing to add on to the story, because it's so condensed.
Well, one of the things that we talked about in class is that the students unfortunately have so little time to prepare for their initial, not so little time to prepare, so little time to perform their initial performance because they're performing with so many others. So they have no choice but to make a small piece.
Right.
But one of the things we talked about is that we hope, since they learn so much more, that this will be a jumping off point, and then in the future they will be able to tell when they tell by themselves.
Right.
So when Henning, for example, I was talking about the young man this year, when he went to Maine and told his story, I'm guessing that he talked more, even if his storytelling piece wasn't longer, when they asked questions, he could say, oh, and yes, and Golda told me this.
That's right.
So that's what we're hoping.
Yeah.
And also I'm hoping, I'll say it to both of you, is that when Abby now tells the story, she can have a scene about today.
Right.
Or about whatever she's going to learn later this evening.
Right.
So that's all part of that continued relationship.
Are you planning to do that, Abby? Do you want to continue with that project?
I do actually. On the way over here, Jennifer told me of an opportunity to do that just in about a month too. So.
Where?
At the Jewish Museum, I'm going to be facilitating a little talk as part of a Holocaust educators conference they do each year for the high school and middle school teachers.
Right.
So Jewish and non-Jewish, people who have a lot of experience and not. And so there's going to be some breakout sessions. So I asked if I could bring some students. So if Abby can work it out, she has a job that day. But if she can work it out, she's going to try to be one of the students.
You know that I went there to the teachers' conference at the Jewish Museum just in the spring. And out of that experience, I was asked to come to 2 middle schools. And I will tell you about that maybe a little later, because that has been an unbelievable experience for me. Yeah.
Well, that really excites me, because what I'm hoping will happen is when these middle school and high school teachers see the students, they will say afterwards, Jennifer, can we get them here? And if not, Abby, because she's already graduated, the next crew that's coming through. So that's why I feel like
they should know that that is available.
Exactly.
You know? But of course, in the case when I went, what really was important for those children was that they really for the first time met a Holocaust survivor. And so that was very important. But I think the continuation, and this is how I feel is your role, if I can say so, give an opinion,
of course,
is what the next generation, and once the survivor won't be here, who will tell the story? So that is what has to be done right now, is to take these students and tell this is what it is, and we have, and this what happened. You know, so I think it's very important what you're going to do.
Bertha,
I wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Don't be nervous. They really are very good, those teachers. It's a wonderful group of people that come.
And Abby's already performed for 700 people at the at the Baltimore Hebrew congregation
Yeah,
when they had
that
the.
year.
I remember that,
Yeah.
and I remember I was there when she performed.
Mhm.
It was wonderful.
That was for the Holocaust commemoration
Yes,
that year.
right, that's fine.
Well, if I am to continue telling your story, I know that both Laura and I talked about this during the class, and we were really wondering what you would have liked added to our stories, if there was something, a specific time or something you wanted added, or just a value you wanted put in there as well.
Well, I tell you, since I met you, I've gone to many places to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked children to write me letters. And I have these letters with me here,
Wow.
which I'm going to share with you. So, some of these letters. And there are two things which I asked them to write letters because I want to. First of all, it's very important for children to get it out because it's traumatic. And so they can't tell it to their parents won't understand. So the best thing is to write it out. And so this way they get it out and write the way they feel. And I find that those children are two things that really are. And one part of the story, of my story, is that when I took my sister Malcolm, and I was waiting there in front of that building, and it was closed. Nobody was there. And that was something that the children just can't get enough of it. You know, I mean, it kind of, the whole world fell apart for them listening to it and imagining, you know. And the other thing which is also, which only the last letters that I got, which I had a teacher in 3.5 hours just yesterday, bringing me these letters. So, and another teacher brought me, that I left in front of the door. She didn't tell me she was coming and I wasn't home, but she left me these there, and you will see these letters. So another thing which I also made a point, and that the children don't understand, and that is, what is it to be a refugee? That you leave your home and then you don't belong anywhere. And all the letters that I got is about you were a refugee. You were a refugee. And you still survived, although you were a refugee, you know? So that kind of a thing is how, when you go to talk to children, is what are the things that impresses them, and you know, what are the impressions that are left behind. And these are the two things that I realize are very, very important. Of course, one letter I got is where, I had to change my names and things like that. Well, you shouldn't lie, but you really didn't have any other option. So, yeah, that's the interpretation, you see, so, of those children. But I tell you, one thing that I had, and I went to two schools which were African-American school in not too good a neighborhood. And one of the questions that they asked me was, am I afraid? And I said, no. Do you feel safe? I said, yes, I feel safe. So when they asked me that, I asked them, how do you feel? And they all shook their hands. They said, no, they don't feel safe. That's what it was. That was very strong. For a day and a half, I walked around thinking about that. You know? So those children, when they walk home, are not safe. And when you walk to the school, there's a policeman there at the door checking who's coming in. And the reaction of those children, it was like, it turned out, and really that's another thing, it turned out that I was an example for them of survival. instead of what the things that I lost and that I didn't have, was not so much as, they said I had to sign my name everywhere, and on the top of the page it said, "You are my hero." This is what it's unbelievable, I tell you, just when you go to these schools. So there's a lot of work to be done for us as Holocaust survivors, and not necessarily what we think should be done,
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'm telling you all of that because the approach that you have to have with those children is what is important to them. And by going and listening, I was in one school, and for an hour I was bombarded with questions. 1 hour. And they didn't let me go. And I had a bodyguard, she brought me to the car to make sure I'd be safe.
What age were these children?
7th grade.
Very different than the 7th graders in the Jewish community here.
Exactly,
I think this is...
It's another world, really. But, and they felt so good that they could really talk about their fears and about, their lives and what they have to live through.
Bertha, I'm so glad you're sharing this with us, because I think this is so important for future students to also hear that future students of this class,
Yes.
that they really need to think, and we talk about this a little in class, but
Yes.
that they need to think about who their audience is,
Exactly.
and that they need to be able to adapt it,
Right.
and that sometimes exactly what you said, what we think is important isn't necessarily what they pick up on, it may be something else.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
and also when you have the question and answer period, you can pick the vibes up, about how do they answer question, and then you can you understand where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to look at that, because the audiences will always be different, and some of them won't be. Unfortunately, some of our Jewish children are not as good, and that makes me very sad.
That's true. And that's also part of our job as educators, to help them really understand. They think they do and they don't. Anymore.
No. I think the mere fact that there is this need as a Jewish person to have the need to have a memorial or talk about the Holocaust, but it's not represented in the way that those children need to know.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you do that? That's a big job. How do you do that for the Jewish children, not so much for the non-Jewish children? So.
Well, I just wanted to ask you, I don't know if Abby has a few
Yeah,
more
you can
questions
ask.
about, just a few more about the Goucher class,
Yes,
and then
right.
we'll take a mini break, and then we'll
Right.
go back into
Okay.
you just telling us your
Whatever.
story.
I don't want to interrupt you
No, this
while you
is,
come here.
this is, we've come to hear about your thoughts on the class and about the project, to have you and Abby interact,
Yeah.
but also to hear your story, because she's going to keep telling your story, and we're going to really show the truth about you and the survivors. We need to have the up-to-the-minute information.
Okay.
I think that's really important. So,
Are you going? How does it look?
Looks great. You look great.
Can you see my face at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of natural conversation, so,
Oh,
but it looks perfect.
okay.
So, any other thoughts on the specific project at Goucher?
Yes.
When these students, and we still want to talk about Sarah, I know that was also an interesting dynamic with Sarah Mills, the other student.
Right.
But borrowing on that for a second, keeping waiting for that for a moment. What was that like for you when the students first came, and you knew this was not going to be your typical interview with some really young students who were just wanted to hear you once? These were students who were college age, or more mature, who really were going to sit in your living room and interview you 3 times and in-depthly hearing an in-depth matter about your life.
Right.
What was that experience like that differed from maybe other interviews?
Well, I tell you, I think that I felt that I had to be very honest, and I tried to be honest. I don't know if I was successful.
It definitely came across as honest. I was grateful because I was, yes.
Yeah, I think I was honest with my feelings. I think that the first interview was the weakest of the three. If I can, you want to get criticism too,
It's the first one, it usually is.
Really?
That's pretty typical. The students are so nervous.
I also don't know if they prepared well for the questions. And some of the questions were very annoying in some
In that,
ways.
well, that was my interview, and what we did for that interview, we fixed for the future ones where we, I don't remember whose
Were
idea
you
it
the
was.
first interview?
I
I don't think so.
I think so because the other two girls were uncomfortable. They had never met a survivor before, so they asked
I
me
see.
to do the
Yeah.
interview. And I think Sarah had suggested that we break up and like put together questions individually,
Yes, right.
which didn't work obviously.
No, it didn't.
And in the future, Laura and I had got together and put together questions.
Yes.
And it was easier for future ones just because we knew you, so we knew like what was important to you, so what questions like then we could ask. And once you had started with the first interview, we knew both Laura and I were very interested in your relationship with your sisters. And
Yes.
so I think we continued that throughout, and we
Yeah.
both, yeah, so for us,
Yes, I think the first interview was in detail about the life in Belgium, and I think that in my case, each case is different. I was too young to really remember a lot, and you would call all the time asking more and more, and there was not much I could tell you because there wasn't that much that happened. I was very young. It was not like I was 14, 15, and I lived already, went to school many more years and so on. I was much more concerned about leaving, and I didn't understand why. And I mean, how many children were in my classroom? Believe me, I couldn't care less about that. And questions like that were asked. Very questions that really were not important to the story, although you wanted to know what life was there.
well, I also think that was, I think when we were given,
really encouraged them to do
right,
that.
so
to
the
be
first,
honest.
each interview was set for each thing, so the first interview was supposed to be life before,
Right.
and then the second interview was,
Right.
so that's what we had prepared for,
Yes.
but I think we definitely should have looked into the fact that you were,
7
right,
young.
so,
See, that it just didn't, it just didn't. And also, instead of asking questions about life with, what was my grandmother like? What do I remember from my uncle? What do I remember? What were some of the things that I, that was not. You see, the relationship of what was the family like. How many members of the family were we? What did my father, I think I mentioned a little bit, but not a lot because I wasn't asked.
Right.
So you see,
It's really good for us to know.
the thing is that when you, I think I had to answer the question. I didn't have a chance to really elaborate myself about what I remember. So that is a part that you also have to give the person, I think, enough time to let them tell you what they remember, not you asking questions.
This is also very good because often I think part of the reason Steve taught the students to do what they did with the focus on before
Yeah.
was because so often the survivors want to go right to the negative of what
right.
happened.
Yes.
And we don't, and I still believe we don't want that. We want to make sure that first interview is about
that's-
you.
okay.
But you're right, you should have the say.
The say of what I remembered, and
Right.
not asking me questions that, because I was small, when it was the first time you went to school, what kind of a dress did you wear? I mean, these things didn't
Right.
mean much to me.
Right.
you
And
know?
that's interesting because how different people are. To me, that is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of things some of the survivors like to talk about, but not everyone. So we need to learn, and I need to learn, how to read that. How
That's
to
right.
tell that for this person, that's enough.
See, I think
Now
for-
what's going on? So this is so,
It was, I tell you,
so
I think we
important.
went back and forth maybe half an hour on that interview.
Mhm.
It was non-stop, and they really didn't know anymore what to ask.
Right.
And I wasn't, remember that?
Mhm. I think what would have been helpful for me, and I know all of us were very nervous when we first came.
Yes, I remember.
I think for the future for the class, and you might be doing this now, we didn't get to talk to you at all, even over the phone first. So like
Yeah.
if I had talked to you over the phone, I would have liked to get an idea of what you would have wanted to talk about,
Right.
just so I could have focused my questions around that.
Exactly.
So I think that would be helpful in the
We
future.
were supposed to. Everybody's supposed to talk to the survivor
Right.
before, so I don't know what happened. But you know what? This is the reality. We learn from.
Yes, right.
And so, we've had a survivor this past year who did not want to talk at all.
That's right.
He wanted them to leave, and other people come in. The students are more quiet, and the survivor goes, and the students come back and say, "It was great, but I didn't ask any questions because she just kept talking, which was good."
Right.
So it's so interesting. So I think if it's okay with both of you, what I would like to do is to discuss you two, or your interview, not just as a model of some of the things that might happen.
Yes.
Is that okay
Yeah.
to say? I mean, I don't have to go into specifics. They're not going to know you, but this is not what I expected from this interview today. But I think it's actually really, really important because
Okay.
we need to know to improve. So thank you for sharing those specifics, and
Yeah.
thank you. I mean, we need to know because Steve Ulta and I, we don't really know what's going on in the room. We can't be there
Exactly.
So-
and you can't guide them because you're not there.
once we're there, right?
Once you know where they come home, they come back with the material, and then this what you can do with the material that they brought
you
you,
have.
right? That you have.
Exactly.
You can't do anything else with it.
This is really making me think that one of our lessons in the beginning should be some examples of an interview, and that as the storytelling teacher, I could even play in a humorous way.
Right.
A role saying, okay, Steve, you be the survivor, I could just sit there, not saying anything. I could be like, okay, what food do you like? What food do you
Right, yeah.
I could
I
do
mean-
that because I think the students
Yes.
will see the different sides in a humorous way, which might make things lighter
Yes.
and the nerves
Yes.
a little.
Yeah. See, some people, their experiences have been so horrific that they really don't want that what they remembered is not so important from before than what they remembered after. During the Holocaust. This is what is actually the idea is also to talk about the Holocaust. But I think the ideas before, after, during and after is a good thing. I think it
Right.
really is important.
One of the things
That I like that. Yes, I like that format. That's a good format.
one of the things we wanted to do that would make it different than the typical is not just hearing about the Holocaust, that we were looking at the survivors as people. This is something horrific that they went through, but we want to tell all their stories, not just the story about the horror.
Right.
And we specifically say to the students, some don't do it, but most do, to try to not have all your scenes about the years 1940 to 1945.
Right.
That obviously many
It-
will.
yes.
What do you think about that? Do you agree with that? Do you?
I think that that's the most important part of it. Really. And I tell you why. Because that part of it is how, after all what you went through, and how do you continue life, and how do you continue life being successful or not being successful, and what effect does it have on you as a Holocaust survivor? What is left of your life? You see, that what is left. How do you pick up the pieces? See, that's what is important to
So it's
know.
really the during
To
and
know.
the after. rather than the before to you?
It all depends what age.
Mm-hmm.
You see, if he's 17, look here, let's take an example of Elie Wiesel. Look, Elie Wiesel, he remembered a lot because he was older, right? So he can describe much more about what he remembered from the before. What it was like, his home, his town, where he lived, all of the people, the rabbi, whatever he described it. He went through some horrific thing during the Holocaust. But look what happened to him after. How did he make it? What did he do in order to bring it to it where he is today? You see, that is as important because this is, again, the survival part of how do you survive, how do you start anew without support of family, on your own, in another country, another language. And of course, another part is very important, and that's something which is part of the Holocaust, and that is what is missing. What did they lose? What did they lose? So what is the price that you pay? And the price that you paid is a very heavy one. So to get, so you always have to remember that they were left alone. They were left to, first of all, to remember the family, the ones that were, exterminated in the Holocaust. So that's their guilt. So you have to also make sure that the guilt that they carry with them, that they survived and others didn't, that's a very important thing, And they don't like to talk about that. But it's there, it's very much there. And some of them cannot make it back to really live a normal life because of that. So
one of the survivors this year, the one who didn't want to share
yes,
much at all, that was the exact case. It was,
right?
he could not
He
get
could-
past that, and that was just the first survivor out of the 5 years of the class, out of all 16 survivors, the first one that was so resistant, and it was such a lesson, not just for the three who
Yeah.
interviewed him, but for the teachers, for the other students to really realize, I don't think any of us realize how deep, we think we do, but how deep the effect, we still can't because we didn't go through it,
Yeah.
but we realized it the most this past year, that this man, he said, you don't know anything.
He's
you don't
broken
care."
forever. He's broken.
It's true.
He's broken. So the damage. So that's, it's the damage of maybe he had a family, maybe he had a wife and children. He can't, and he tried again. Maybe he has a new family. And believe you me, I met plenty of those. I'm, a lot of that. So when I go to talk to children, I don't go into that part because it's too painful for children at that age to even relate to that. So that I leave out. But as college students, when it always is important. It depends what group. If you talk to children that age, then you have to make it shorter and half an hour and something like that. That's enough. But if you talk to adults, then it's very important to make sure that they should understand. And people don't want to understand.
Why do you think people don't want to understand?
I think part of it because it's too painful. It's too painful. You don't want to hear painful things. And I think that it's something that people don't understand. It's something that you didn't live through it, you don't understand it. What it really means, an enormous loss. It means enormous loss as far as family, but it's also enormous loss of maybe your childhood, enormous loss of your comfort, what kind of a life you had, and support. The biggest problem with the Holocaust survivor is that they really don't have any support system. You don't have any mother, father, or uncle, or aunt to go to. That's it. You are there. You have Holocaust survivors that are your friends. These are the ones that understand you the best.
Thank you. you for teaching us so much about
Am I
this.
teaching you? Am
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. Oh, yes, because this is what this class is about.
Yeah.
All Uta, Steve, and I can do is bring a little, some skills from each of the realms that
Yes.
we focus on,
Right.
and hope that we're teaching something that is going to bridge this gap between you and you.
Right.
And since we can't be them, the college student, and we
Right.
certainly can't be you and truly
Sure.
understand.
Right.
Steve, of course, was the son of a survivor, so he has some
Yes.
outlook from that.
Right.
But it's just hoping that our knowledge and our deep caring
Yes.
for learning about
Yeah.
this.
That's
will-
wonderful. You couldn't do better than what you're doing. You
Thank you.
really can't.
But I think we still have to learn more. I think we still, I know I do, I need to listen more to the survivors directly,
Yes.
because it's one thing to help shape the class, but I need to hear from you. So
Yes.
this is really, it's about showing the other people what we're doing, but I'm realizing now it's also about, for me, learning how to make this class even better.
Yeah, I hope that, I think I'm quite honest because I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I tell you, usually what happens, let's say if you have a story,
Mm-hmm.
a big story like that, well, over the generation it dwindles down and it's interpreted differently. Because he read a book somewhere and it tells it a little different and different point of view, and all of a sudden he picks that up and then he distorts the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good that there are museums where you can go and see the real thing, and that's very important. But yeah, I mean, you know, right now I was at the Holocaust Museum. They have that Nazi propaganda. I went to see that. Did you?
I'm going to see it as part of that Holocaust the conference in August
Yeah.
that Abby might be
Oh,
speaking
right.
at, that we're
That's,
going there.
that's very powerful. That's very powerful. Yeah, and for instance, I was there, and I got a book about the Holocaust from there. It really is a very good book to have as a tool even in this class.
Mm-hmm.
But I got a newspaper, and that was really amazing. That is, I can show it to you, I just have it here. Then, what was written in the American newspapers in 1940, in 1938, in 1942, in 1944, and you have clips like that, and they, you know, they made, this is the whole thing I can bring to.
Yes,
It's
definitely.
amazing what was known and how it was ignored.
Mm-hmm.
So how many people could have been saved, you know? So
Mary, oh, sorry. Did I just say something?
go ahead.
No, this is
Ask me
probably really
questions.
Alex.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just say this and then turn it out. And I still want to ask you about Sarah Mills briefly before we.
Who's Sarah Mills?
She was the other student.
Ah, the other students?
So,
Yeah.
but first I just want to say something about Mary Farfel,
Yeah.
who is a woman who lives in this neighborhood, who's a member of my synagogue, who is somewhere within your age range, but I don't know.
Ah, we're very good friends.
You are good friends.
Yeah.
So I interviewed her just recently about her life. She was born in America, had a very, very different life, obviously, than you did.
Right.
But I asked her what she want as part of the interview,
Yeah.
since of course she was alive at that time. I asked her what her memories are of learning about the Holocaust, and the memory that sticks out in my mind the most was she still, I guess she was college age at that time. Is that possible?
Maybe no, I
Toward
don't
the
think
end?
she was.
No, she wasn't that old. So maybe she was still in high school age, but she remembers looking over at her father, reading the newspaper, a newspaper that did say at least something. It was a Jewish newspaper, and tears just falling out of his eyes,
Yeah.
reading what was happening in Europe.
Right.
And that was really the only thing she knew was watching her father, and when she
Right.
asked him and saying, these Jewish people are being killed.
Yeah.
But it wasn't in the general newspapers, but it was getting here.
I'll show you. I'll bring you the newspaper.
Well, you talked a little bit about your fear for the future as people, as if we don't continue your story. But what have you done? What are the messages that you have imparted, at least as the matriarch of your family, to your children and grandchildren, and you want to make sure that they will continue on as well?
Well, I tell you, it has been an interesting experience for me as far as doing that. My point was that I do not want at the time, and I think I spoke on the interview with you about that, I didn't want the children, I didn't tell my story to the children until they were older. And now all my grandchildren, they all interviewed me. And so I went to Philadelphia and I spoke to in a Hebrew school, one of my grandchildren, and my oldest one, he wrote a paper and he got a A and he interviewed me too. So all the grandchildren know about it. Yes, and I've had some enormously interesting experiences with that. And I also found out a lot of things since then. But I think my son is very much aware of it. I wouldn't say that none of my children are involved as second generation. None of them really want to be involved with it. But they know that I am very involved. And I show them and I talk to them and, you know, I don't want to make them feel that they have to do it because I'm a Holocaust survivor. They have their own lives, so they have to make choices. But they are very much aware. But I never took them, for instance, their trips that I did, but they all came and they all wanted to see it and want to know everything about it because they know the story. So, and it's very interesting. My twin girls, when they were 14, my mother came to visit and they interviewed her. And it's called Oma's Story. I have and later on, when she was already in her 70s, my daughter in Israel, at that time she was living in Israel, she came to my mother, to her grandmother, and she said, look here, you have two possibilities. Or you go to Yad Vashem, and that's a Holocaust museum in Israel, in Jerusalem. I'm doing it for the tape. Okay, and or I come home and I will interview you. So we interviewed 6 hours, 2 hours each time, and she told from the beginning as a child where she was born until before she passed away. So she was already, but she did it for the grandchildren, not so much for us. For me, she never wanted to talk to me about that. I couldn't communicate with her that way. She never wanted to relive this. Oh, for her it was something that she couldn't talk about. Yeah.
Abby, did you have anything else you wanted to ask?
Well, something else that's really interesting to me. You were talking about how you're worried about the Jewish education system
Yes.
not fulfilling their end, even though the kids know about the Holocaust. They're not. They don't fully understand the personal aspect of it. I think you were trying to say. I was wondering what you think that Jewish educators should do to ensure that your message gets across, since I think for me that's really interesting.
Yes, I can understand because you are already the second generation. How do you deal with that?
Right.
You know, there are some very, very good workshops in New York about that. As a matter of fact, I have an article. I get all kinds of magazines. If you want to, I can share them with you. And they are really very good, very, very good. And they are talking about the future of education about the Holocaust. And mostly for children, for educators. And I think that the attitude about, I think what you really have to do is, the way I see it is, to instill in the children that it's their responsibility to carry it on. And in what way do they want to feel that and it would be a good idea to hear their opinion of what they don't want to do in order to understand what they want to do. It's better to go that way. you know? So we heard enough of it, but what are some of the things that you feel are important to carry on? And is it important for you? You know, is it important? Or is it history already and it doesn't mean much? It was already 60, 70 years ago. Who cares about that? You know, this is what that is all about. So how do you communicate with children like that? And I also think that the teachers are not well prepared. Believe you me, I wish you would take some of those children from the Hebrew school and give them a lesson in your college. That's what they need to do, those teachers. Because believe you me, they have no clue. I go to these schools, and they all feel wonderful that here is a Holocaust survivor coming to talk to those children. But you never see the teacher really asking you questions. So they don't even know what to ask. So think about that part of it. How do you make those teachers, see, they don't relate to the children the right thing. It's just a ceremony and that's it.
Well, fortunately, I can tell you, which hopefully will make you feel better about that. For one of the examples is for now, I believe it's been 3 years, we've gone to Bertha, Israel, with the 8th through 10th graders. Yom HaShoah, Beth Israel in Owings Mills, the conservative synagogue in Owings Mills.
Yeah.
And we brought between 2 and 3 students every year, including this past year.
Yeah.
And there, the educators are excellent. Phil Jacobs, the
Yeah.
editor of the publisher now of the Jewish Times, is one of the teachers.
Oh, that's good.
Rachel Glazer is one of the best educators in Baltimore. She's the principal, and she has
Rachel
been.
Glazer, I know her. She's an Israeli, right?
Yes, she lived in Israel. She grew up in Greece, then moved to America, then made Aliyah, then moved back.
Yeah.
And her children, or one of them is about my age, has 3 children, and then she has 2 that are a little
Does she
older.
live on Joliet Road?
She lives in Owings Mills. Is that Joliet?
No,
A
so
different
that's
Rachel
not the
Glazer?
same Rachel.
Okay. So she is just a phenomenal educator, and 3 of our students from this year's class
Yeah.
came and performed, and at the end, and she has appreciated it every year,
Yes.
but this year in particular, she said, and you were there one of the years, remember you came? She said to the students, I am truly honored that you were here. And Rachel is not a person to use words like that unless she really means it.
Yeah.
And she was just blown away by their knowledge, by their different styles of sharing the stories.
Who?
Rachel Glazer, of the students this year.
Ah.
Oh, she loved when Abby came too.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember she said she was so glad that we put Abby last because hers was so strong.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So this year we had 3 all strong students.
Wonderful.
And it was just amazing. Those 8th through 10th graders, not a word for more than an hour. I mean, just into it. And they did ask questions, and the teachers did ask good questions there.
Good.
So there is hope, and I hope this Jewish museum, obviously I heard their training is excellent.
Yeah,
And then
it
hopefully,
really is good.
hopefully with this additional teaching them what we are
Yes,
doing,
Yes.
we'll give them
Wonderful.
another layer of
Yeah,
possibilities for
yes,
the class.
yes. Yeah,
So,
whatever you do is positive. Really.
yeah.
Oh, no. I mean, I was really, I really like what you said about the Jewish education system because I was a product, I am a product of of Schechter and like
Yes.
My synagogue Hebrew school, and I understand, I think before I came and talked to you, and you even mentioned something about this to me, I think that a lot of kids who grew up in the system believe that they know about it, and
That's right.
they've, been taught all the facts. And so we think we know everything, but it's the personal story, and we also don't understand, since everyone we know, like in that system, in the Jewish education world, already knows about the Holocaust, so we think that it's common knowledge, but what we don't realize is what you have shared, and so I think that's why I wanted to come back to that question.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you had very good questions. I think it's important. This way you can really relate, to the. Look here, this